Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Julie Lafford, the Executive Director for Alumni Engagement here at York University. Thanks for joining us today. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub Speakers Series, which features educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. We're pleased to be able to bring this series online to allow even more alumni and friends to hear from some of the university's leading scholars. Today's session was rescheduled from its original date on September 9th, so we could take the opportunity to join the collective call to action to support the movement against anti-Black racism and police violence against Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. We appreciate our speaker, Dr. Winfield's flexibility, and of course your flexibility, you in the audience, and for your support of this decision to stand in solidarity with the Black community. Along with Dr. Winfield's session today, we're happy to share that we'll be covering a wide range of topics throughout the fall term, many of which are suggestions that you shared with us. I also want to share some exciting news from New York. On September 22nd, a groundbreaking event marked the beginning of construction of the York University's Markham Center campus. This $275 million, 10-story, state-of-the-art campus is expected to open in fall 2023 and welcome over 4,000 students. Also, just last week, President Linton and the university's senior leadership team answered questions about academic, research, and professional work at an all-community virtual town hall. If you'd like to see a video recording, you can view it at conversations.info.yorku.ca. For other university stories and updates, look for the October issue of our monthly e-newsletter, Alumni Matters, which should arrive in your inbox next week. Although we aren't all in the same location, we recognize many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Before beginning today's lecture, we always like to get to know our audience a little bit. So today, a poll will be appearing on your screen asking, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation right now? So please take a moment to respond, and I'll give you a moment to do that. Thank you so much for participating in the poll. It's helpful for us and for our speakers to have an idea about who's in the audience and the knowledge each of you have about today's event. And I see the results here. 66% of you feel somewhat informed, and while many of you feel minimal or new to this topic, and I'm sure nonetheless, we all have a lot to learn. If you need help with the Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team's ready to help you. The same button can be used to submit your questions for our speaker to answer during the Q&A period following today's presentation. And for those of you watching live on Facebook, you can submit any questions or comments through the comments selection for the video, and the team will send them my way. So on to the main event. Today's talk is titled COVID-19 and the Environment, Behavior, Policy, and Implications for Sustainability, featuring Dr. Mark Winfield, professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change and co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative. Professor Winfield is the coordinator of the MES-JD joint program in the Faculty of EUC, which is Environment and Urban Change, and a member of the York University Senate. He's also a 2020-2021 York University Visiting Scholar at the University of Toronto's Massey College. He's published articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. Professor Winfield has acted as an advisor to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario and Federal Commissioner for Environment and Development. He's a member of the Conseil d'administration of Transition Energetique Quebec, a Crown corporation established in 2017 to implement a low-carbon energy transition strategy for Quebec. Welcome, Dr. Winfield. It's a pleasure having you today. I'm so looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. I must admit I was a little bit tempted to put new to this topic as well in response to the poll, because we're all very much in new territory. But this will be an opportunity, or has been an opportunity, to kind of pull some thoughts together about where we are in terms of the impact of the COVID pandemic and its effect on environment and on public policy. And so in a sense, the thoughts here are very much a work in progress. I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. So I'm going to touch on a number of themes here as we go through. Sorry, just having to transition slides, which is not happening. Oh, here we go. Okay. So the pandemic has sort of raised a whole series of questions around the viability of existing economic and social models and approaches to behavior. And in some ways, it's been portrayed as potentially an inflection point around whether this is a stage at which we can transition in the direction, particularly of a more low carbon economy and society, or is it a moment at which we're sort of doubling down on existing pathways as we sort of try and get back to normal? As we'll see, there's quite a bit of tension in the public policy discourses about these themes. What I want to talk about today is a little bit about what do we know about the impacts of the pandemic on environment, and also some wider and economic and social issues. What are we seeing in terms of governmental responses, in terms of policy responses, and how they affect the environment and sustainability? We want to talk a little bit about longer term effects on behavior. And at this stage, we're very much in the realm of speculation. We have seen some significant behavioral changes, but we don't know whether those are permanent or whether these are things which will move back towards pre-pandemic normalcy. It's potential, hopefully, we get effective vaccines and more effective treatments, and we return to some degree of normal, at least in terms of the threat posed by the pandemic. And then I'll finish on some thoughts on where are we at and where do we go from here. In terms of our understanding of the impacts, we know there are a number of dimensions of this. For example, we've seen a very dramatic decline in international travel, especially air travel. Standard figures are putting 80, 90, 95% reduction, especially in international air travel. More broadly, we've seen also evidence that we've seen very significant shifts in work patterns that don't involve long distance travel, especially around the viability of remote work models, at least for white collar workers. A very different situation, as I'll talk about, around those who are in the business of actually doing. But for the last 6 months, we've been engaged in this very large scale experiment, effectively, around the ability of people to use tools like Zoom to work from home, basically to not need to commute to work. And we've seen that at least demonstrated as viable in the short term. I think there's a lot of debate in the long term about how this works in terms of work environments and collaboration, social interaction. But for now, that's been accompanied by dramatic declines in use of public transit and dramatic declines in road traffic as well. That has translated across the planet into significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, indeed the most significant drop seen since there have been records of this. The estimates vary, but are typically in the range of 15 to 20% reduction in daily greenhouse gas emissions relative to where we were pre-pandemic. We have a reasonable breakdown as well. Again, there's some debate about this, about where exactly those reductions have come from. Surface transportation basically burning fossil fuels for road transportation, fundamentally commuting, among other things, has been the biggest source of the reductions. Industrial uses of energy are also down significantly, particularly coal, for example, and electricity generation, not here in Ontario, but in other places. Industrial uses of fossil fuels as inputs are also down. You can see the reduction in aviation aviation-related emissions as well. We've seen other collateral benefits. Probably the most marked has been around air quality, with the reduction in burning of fossil fuels for transportation, industry, and power generation. We have seen very significant improvements in air quality. Reductions in human activity in other ways seem to have had some beneficial effects in the short term on wildlife as well, although we need to see how that plays out longer term. A couple of other things have emerged through all of this. Although on the one hand, we have the story of relative success in terms of the ability of what we might term white collar workers, including university professors, ability to work relatively effectively at home. And we do need to keep in mind that's a relatively recent set of developments. I'm not sure the video conferencing technologies were there even 5 years ago, which would have enabled us to engage in the relatively seamless transfer to an online environment that we've been able to carry out. At the other end of the scale, though, the pandemic has also reminded us very, very much of the importance of the people in society, economy, who are the doers in healthcare, in warehousing and distribution, particularly around food, in grocery stores. And the situation has also highlighted the precariousness of the employment models in those sectors, the sort of gig model of itinerant temporary employment. And indeed, we've also seen in the case of healthcare, I mean, those employment models were fairly instrumental in the catastrophe that happened in the long-term care sector in Ontario and Quebec, that the non-permanent itinerant nature of the staffing, and that was entirely a function of the business models being employed in the sector. It certainly had nothing to do, or certainly nothing deliberate on the part of the actual workers. They were put into this position where these were, by working in multiple facilities, this was the only way in which they could put together a reasonable livelihood. So we have been reminded of the importance of those folks in the economy and society and their situation. What responses we see, though, remains to be seen. We've also been through a very dramatic demonstration of the vulnerability of global supply chains. This was particularly acute around medical supplies, particularly in the March-April period, but even at this stage that we discovered that effectively the manufacturing of many of these pieces of equipment, N95 masks being the one that got the most attention, but ventilators and other equipment too, had effectively been offshored, that we had no domestic manufacturing capacity anymore, some potential to ramp it up, but not that quickly. And indeed, in the face of the crisis, the countries that did have manufacturing capacity were very, very firm that their intention, indeed their behavior, was that they would supply their domestic markets first and then think about export markets later, regardless of whatever contracts might have been placed or what trade agreements might underlie the conversation. In the face of a crisis, national interests moved to the forefront. I mean, more broadly, this did also highlight the vulnerability of global supply chains, the fragility of just-in-time delivery models and very long supply chains. And that may or may not set in motion a series of changes in terms of economic structure. Again, we've sort of seen the problem, but what kind of responses we're going to get are really unknowns in the long term at this stage. What we've seen in terms of governmental responses has been decidedly kind of bipolar in some ways, in the sense that there have been two kind of discourses that seem to have defined the way in which governments have responded beyond the sort of immediate impacts and management of the pandemic, but thinking more in terms of the longer term, what does recovery or reconstruction look like from this huge involuntary economic downturn? And there you get two sort of distinct schools of thought. One which I term the doubling downers, who are sort of talking about a return to normal, basically to move back to where we were in pre-pandemic terms. And that tends to focus very strongly on doubling down on existing economic pathways. And we see this very strongly. You see it from Mr. Kenny in Alberta, to a certain degree Doug Ford in Ontario, when he's not talking about people doing donuts at Wasaga Beach. His language is very much about returning the economy to where it was. So this is not seen as a transitional moment, and indeed in terms of specific policies, we've seen measures which are very much about reinforcing the position of established economic actors and sectors. On the other hand, we have heard a lot about the notion that this is a transformational opportunity, that this has demonstrated the viability, for example, of economic models that involve far less travel and therefore far less travel-related greenhouse gas emissions, for example. And this is very much cast in a building back better sort of rhetoric or language. We see that very strongly, for example, from Mr. Biden. At least early on, the federal government's language around this was very much in this sort of tone as well, although as we'll see, there has been some backing off lately. Indeed, when we look at what governments have actually done in terms of what they've talked about, it does seem the double downers are the winners in terms of actual policy measures. Indeed, by this measure here, Canada is among the worst offenders in terms of actually providing new support to the fossil fuel sector. There has been some emphasis in sort of what you might call green energy as well. There's a lot of talk about that in the Broad speech. But as those who follow public policy always say, follow the money. And if you follow the money, where it tends to lead is precisely back in the direction of reestablishing the economy as it was. In the case of Canada, this has large focus on fossil fuels, less direct subsidization so far. It's principally been in the form of the absorption of liabilities on behalf of the oil and gas industry, for example, for abandoned oil and gas wells in Alberta, which removes a sort of a large long-term liability from the sector. So at this stage, at least in practice, what we've seen in policy has been very much in the double down pathway as opposed to build back better pathway. In terms of public responses, again, we're very much in a space of unknowns. We have a lot of anecdotal information that's floating around, but very little hard data in terms of, are these things significant trends or are they short-term responses to the pandemic? For example, here in the Greater Toronto area in Ontario, this month's cover of Toronto Life magazine was all about this. Are we seeing an exodus from urban cores, particularly in the Greater Toronto area, to the suburbs and exurbia? Toronto Star had a link to a whole website which could help you figure out where it is in Ontario you want it to be that wasn't downtown or midtown Toronto. Whether this is really a long-term trend or not at this stage is an unknown, or whether it's permanent. People may find there are all kinds of challenges living in rural communities, everything from internet connections not being very good to realizing that if you have children, they may be spending 2 hours a day on a school bus, to discovering that winters in Haliburton or Muskoka or further north are very, very different experiences from what you have in Toronto. We've also seen, and we have more evidence on this, as I mentioned before, one of the things we have very definitely seen is an abandonment of mass transit, to some trending in the favor of automobiles. In some places, this has been fairly catastrophic. I mean, the TTC in Toronto is talking about 80% reductions in ridership. In New York, it's, on the subway, it's 95% reductions. And how this plays out in the long term is still very unclear, especially now in the context of the second wave. I mean, are people going to go back to transit? Are they going to need to go back? And this may have large implications around transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. And at this stage, we don't know, but certainly, private cars are seen as a safe place and a relatively safe form of transportation. Other options have suffered from limitations as well. Active transportation like biking and walking only works over certain distances. People are subject to physical limitations, and of course, I can say even as someone who's has biked up to York occasionally, in the winter it simply becomes a non-viable option. So where this goes in the long term, again, we don't know. It could mean that our transportation-related emissions are going to go up, or they may stay relatively low. Similarly, around urban form, a great deal of discussion about whether this marks the end of high-density, high-rise housing developments, excuse me, like the sort of very high-rise condominium developments we've been seeing in downtown Toronto and midtown Toronto. A lot of questions about the viability and desirability of those housing models where you have, lineups for elevators, limited capacity, no capacity to expand elevator service. Are people going to go for lower density, more dispersed and distributed housing, potentially at the urban periphery? In our part of the world, that largely means onto high-value agricultural and natural heritage lands. Again, we don't know at this stage how it will play out, but it could have significant implications in terms of urban form, and with it, particularly transportation, as of course, if you move to more spread out models, even if people are working from home, transportation for other purposes is going to become more of a challenge. We have seen some effort at onshoring critical supply chains. This was Mr. Ford and Mr. Trudeau at the 3M plant in Brockville, I think it was about a month ago now, onshoring manufacturing of N95 masks. How much of this is going to happen, again, we don't know. It seems governments are certainly prepared to intervene around critical medical supply chains, and we're seeing conversations happening, particularly around vaccine manufacturing for COVID. There are bigger questions here about are other forms of manufacturers sort of looking at the situation we've been through and the recognition of, on the one hand, the sort of distributed global just-in-time supply chains are certainly very, very efficient, but they've also now been clearly demonstrated to be very, very non-resilient and very, very vulnerable. And how that's going to play out economically in the longer term is an unknown at this stage. So to sort of sum up, we're still at a stage of seeing, we've got both now the sort of immediate reemergence of the pandemic as we seem to be moving into a second wave. But beyond that, we do have these questions about where do we go from here. At the federal level, although there was lots of language about green recovery in the throne speech, there has also been some significant backpedaling, some suggestions on the part of the Minister of the Environment, even that perhaps the government had got ahead of the public in terms of those sorts of approaches. The approach here in Ontario, I'm afraid, is rather more straightforward. Mr. Ford is very much a double down on the past kind of approach to things. And indeed, one of the things that I think has been very clear is that the environment has been a very, very big loser in the Ford government's responses to COVID and its efforts at economic recovery, be this around climate change, be this around industrial pollution, be this around land use, forestry, wildlife. The response has not been very good or encouraging, to put it mildly. And then finally, of course, this evening, we're going to see this debate in potentially very stark form between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. And again, Mr. Trump is very much about getting back to normal, whether the pandemic is controlled or not. Whereas Mr. Biden is very strongly in the Build Back Better category, very, very much influenced by the Green New Deal folks within the Democratic Party. So, of course, what happens on November 3rd could be quite determinative in terms of what happens in the United States, and then that has significant implications for Canada as well. I think I'm going to wrap there and move into the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Winfield. That was a fantastic presentation, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions coming in due time. Audience members, please feel free to ask your questions now. I see some of them coming in. I will kick things off, however. Professor Winfield, is there any location you know of, either within Canada or globally, where they've leveraged this opportunity to make positive changes towards more sustainable environmental practices?
I think the place you see this the most has been within the European Union. Okay. And they've been very, very sort of clear in seeing this as a potential inflection point, a point at which investments are going to be made in economic reconstruction, and that we should take the opportunity to move those investments certainly in a low carbon transition, especially. And that picks up on themes that were already strongly there within the European Union, particularly on the part of Germany, for example. They've been pushing the EU very strongly on climate change already. So they seem to be the folks. For them, to a certain degree, this was an acceleration or an opportunity to accelerate pathways that they were already quite firmly committed on. Others have been less clear on exactly, what does this look like, and say in the case of the United States, it's very much in the balance of what's going to happen in early November in terms of where the election goes and what sorts of administration we end up with there.
Thank you. So I have a first audience question from Tim Knight, who asks, it's unfortunate that any reduction in support of fossil fuel development in Canada is spun as alienating the West. And by this, I assume it is meant Western Canada. How can we get past this perspective? Can we invest in green energy development projects in the West and reduce support in tar sand development?
It's a very good question, and it's one I found myself in a conversation with a number of Westerners earlier this week. I think it's a question of framing in part, but it's also a series of questions about larger trends which were already present around the future of fossil fuels. And regardless of what's happening in climate change policy, we've been seeing very significant shifts in the sector that were happening even before COVID in terms of decline of world oil price, declining demand. We're seeing, discussions from people like Mark Carney and others who are sort of the upper levels of, global finance, talking about the need to move investment away from fossil fuels. Alberta is particularly vulnerable given that the oil sands especially are a very, very high cost producer, and so require lots of investment. Indeed, we've been seeing investment moving away from the oil sands. So, and we see conversations happening around pension funds, other large long-term sources of capital that are saying we're moving out of fossil fuels. And that, I think, might be the more constructive approach to the conversation with Western Canada, by which we mostly mean Alberta and Saskatchewan, to be very direct. Folks from BC get very upset if you include them in that same category, although they have their own issues. I think it's partially a question of broaching this issue with Alberta, that it's not entirely a question of climate change. It's about larger structural economic trends as well, which suggest that fossil fuels cannot continue to be the foundation of the Alberta economy forever, and that we need to be engaging in a discussion about a longer-term transition and diversification of the economies of Alberta and Saskatchewan. That may be a more constructive path, given that it's not just Greenpeace and environmentalists who are saying this. It's a lot of other thoughtful people as well who are saying that pathway has to change. The unfortunate part has been so far with the current government of Alberta, they seem to be the ultimate double downers. and do not seem very interested in talking about transitions at all. Ms. Notley's government, I think, was much more open to these kinds of conversations, but they're not in power in Alberta anymore. So it's a very difficult moment, and it has very serious adverse effects on our ability to deal with the climate change issue more generally at a national level, given the centrality of the growth in emissions from Alberta and Saskatchewan to the overall sort of projections for Canada as a whole.
Thanks. So I have another audience question. Ria Perot asks, what organizations exist in Toronto and Ontario working towards the Build Back Better scenario, and how can we support them?
There are a number of organizations who have been engaged around this at different levels. I mean, I'm hesitant to go endorsing specific groups, but clearly the Toronto Environmental Alliance does tremendous work at the level of City Council. And we need to remember that the City of Toronto in many ways is a leader among cities in not just North America, but certainly in Canada and in the world in terms of what it's doing around climate change already. And so anything that reinforces that is very, very useful. Environmental Defense, another organization which has been very involved in green economy activities and building a green economy alliance, more focused at the provincial level, but again, potentially a very, very influential organization. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention the Pembina Institute, for which I used to work. So, disclosure there, but very, very actively engaged in these conversations at the federal level and in Western Canada. It's an Alberta-based organization, so it's very much involved in those conversations as well. So those are some examples of organizations that have been advancing these kinds of conversations. I mean, there's a spectrum. 350.org is more activist. Extinction Rebellion, which some of our students are very involved, is also more direct in its approach. But we're in a world where perhaps a bit of that is needed to keep this conversation moving forward. To say it's not a complete loss. We certainly have language of the federal government that says the right thing, and City of Toronto and other cities are very much in the doing space. Their challenge is they need much more supportive policies from the federal and provincial levels to be really able to move forward what they would like to do.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for your question. And a related note, Susan Weiss asks for examples of doubling down that you've seen recently in Ontario in relation to climate change.
Difficult to know where to start. I think obviously some of this had been set in motion already pre-pandemic. I mean, the dismantling of the previous government's climate change action plan, the repeal of legislation around cap and trade, all of the associated programming, the dismantling of the province's entire energy efficiency strategy as well. Based around electricity, the gas part survived. I think where this has been probably most pronounced has been around, two areas really. One has been around land use planning. And we've seen both legislation and policies, most recently in the redrafting of the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which essentially are compelling municipalities to facilitate sprawl, which in some cases have rewritten the rules around places like Midtown Toronto and Downtown Toronto, which have been subject to very intense development pressures, to basically tell the developers they can do whatever they want. At one point, the government was proposing to allow gravel pits in endangered species habitat. They did back down on that, but the overall orientation of land use planning policy has been profoundly shifted in a direction that is a mixture of going very tall in certain urban locations, but also facilitating and virtually compelling urban sprawl at the urban periphery as well in 905. The other most obvious one was, of course, and again, this was through Bill 195, which was the pandemic recovery legislation was the effective dismantling of the environmental assessment process in the province, which had existed in one form or another. It was actually Bill Davis who brought it in 1975. And indeed, the original process was actually conceived of largely by faculty environmental studies professors at the time. So York had a legacy element to that. And that regime has effectively been dismantled. It used to be we had fairly comprehensive coverage that you had to engage in some sort of environmental review of infrastructure projects, particularly in the public sector on the part of the province, municipalities, conservation authorities, before you proceeded. And that part of the process effectively has been eliminated. The application of the process now, which was compulsory in Ontario around public sector projects, has now been made entirely discretionary and is really just limited to very, very large projects. And even there have been left very large gaps. Large mining projects, for example, remain excluded. So I would point to that as well in the immediate term has been around land use and environmental assessment. But we also need to keep in mind that with the Ford government, I hate to say, but a great deal of damage was done before the pandemic as well, with the dismantling of the climate change strategy. But there had also been major changes to the rules around industrial water pollution, for example, and around waste management facilities. There were things in motion around land use. So there's sort of a trajectory that was already there that is continuing, and the risk here is particularly with land use of embedding urban forms, which will be very hard to service either through transit or active transportation, depending on what sort of scenario we find ourselves in. We're effectively embedding relatively high carbon and high cost urban forms, which we're going to be stuck with for a very, very long time if we don't change direction.
Thank you. That's very worrisome, and it's good to know, and a great answer to a really great question. Thank you. I have a question from Mike Sullivan. Professor Winfield, if you were advising the federal government, what action would you recommend be the first step they take towards Build Back Better?
I think there are a number of places the federal government can go, and it's a mixture of both standing to where it already was. I mean, we were making some progress around carbon pricing, which, although there are debates, is the price high enough to really affect behavior? It certainly sends a very powerful signal. And unfortunately, there's been a bit of backpedaling there already, that the federal government has effectively caved into Ontario and New Brunswick, letting them get away with very, very weak, virtually non-existent carbon pricing regimes for industrial emitters. So a little more backbone would be a good start. In terms of more specific measures, the big one that always strikes me and that has very positive effects in terms of employment and housing is around energy efficiency retrofits for existing buildings. You have standards for new buildings, but we also have large existing building fleets. And that's where a large opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also significant employment opportunities and significant opportunities for improvement in housing quality, particularly for lower income residents, are all there. And I think that's an area where the federal government could do much more. There were previously programs in that space, something called the Guide for Homes, for example, a quite a sophisticated program, which could be very, very effective. The other thing I know Mike will have on his mind, and has been on my mind too, is we do need to be very sensitive to the impact of things like carbon pricing to low-income Canadians and those who may be more at the margin. And we need to be very careful in the design of programs, including carbon pricing regime, to make sure that we have appropriate measures so that those who are already on the edge are not pushed over the edge. Rather, we want to be making sure we're providing appropriate supports. But again, retrofits in existing low-income housing especially can be very, very useful in that context.
Thank you. I have a couple of related questions up next from Suruj Paul. Jagmohan and Elaine Copsey. Both of them ask slightly different questions, but they're both concerned about depletion of arable land and farming practices and how we can change the sustainability of our food supply. So Rujpa particularly asked about what YorkU is working on, but so feel free to ask, blend that into if there's anything you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated question with many dimensions to it. I mean, there is quite a lot of work happening at York on these questions, particularly my colleague Rod McRae, for example, in our own faculty, and our other colleagues too, who are very active in this space. So we're actually a significant leader in this area in terms of research and thinking about what does this look like. There are multiple dimensions to this. Some of them relate to the land use planning issues that I was referring to earlier, because of course in Southern Ontario, where these issues are most acute, that sprawling urban development is landing precisely on the best agricultural land in the country, which has significant food security implications. It has significant implications around transportation of food as well. So it means you're going further and further, greater distances. How this will play out is again one of these unknowns in terms of how global supply chains will play out and their reliability. The moment we've kept the border open with the United States, there are longer term and deeper questions about the viability of existing agricultural models, particularly from the viewpoint of family or individual farmers, as opposed to corporatization of farming. And the pandemic in some ways has added more pressures. It put a useful, although in some ways tragic, spotlight on the reliance on itinerant foreign workers in the agricultural sector in Ontario especially, which I don't think was the significance of that, I don't think was widely grasped, and also the conditions under which those workers work, and the role that they play in sustaining the food supply. So these are, there's multiple dimensions to this, to which I don't claim to be a subject matter expert in this. York has other colleagues who are, and they may be very good candidates to speak in this series. But it certainly put a spotlight on all of these dimensions: the land dimension, the economic viability dimension, the supply chain dimension, and the workforce dimension around what is happening in that sector, which in our sort of urban context tends to be somewhat invisible to us.
Thanks for that. So I have time for one more question, and I'd like to ask you to kind of look forward a little bit for us if you'll pull out your crystal ball. You had a great slide earlier on which looked at sort of a graph that showed where CO2 savings were happening in which sectors. So looking forward, what behaviors or sectors do you think going forward there'll be more permanent change?
That's a good question at this stage, to which we don't necessarily know the answer. It seems most likely, and it's it carries complications, that as we're doing now, this global experiment in remote work seems somewhat successful, although we're speaking to each other from basements and other places. That part seems likely to stick in some way, shape, or form. One imagines that people will be reluctant to get back into mass transit systems and services, and that potentially is problematic in terms of transportation and greenhouse gases and urban form. We don't know how that plays out, but it seems for those who can, but of course that in some ways reinforces certain bifurcations between those of us who are in what you might call the white collar category, for whom that is a viable option, and what I term the doers, who turn out to be so absolutely vital to the functionality of the economy and society, for whom that's not such an option, and we clearly need to move in terms of much more stable and reasonable employment arrangements for people who are carrying out those functions. That seems to me the part that's going to stick the most in some way, shape, or form, because of course employers are likely to start to seize on the opportunity that they were already heading towards in some cases of, you know, desk sharing and office sharing and all these sorts of things, because it lets them offload a lot of costs in terms of space and everything else effectively onto their employees in some ways. So that may stick. What happens, the other one I wonder about a lot, the other two really, one is high-rise urban forms. And you know, given what people have been through and the problem of relying on a bank of 2, 3, 4 elevators and distancing and everything else, I think has demonstrated a vulnerability which may cause people to be much more reluctant to make those kinds of housing choices. And again, I think the third one is going to be around the globalized supply chains. And are we going to see beyond the health side, where governments are very involved, are we going to see companies saying the risk profile there is bigger than we thought, and that we've experienced great efficiency but severe lack of resiliency, and is that going to cause us to rethink our business models?
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We're out of time for questions. We always run out of time for questions. I really want to thank you for sharing your time, sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, Dr. Winfield.
Well, thank you very much, and thank the audience for their questions too. They're all very good and very interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Before we say goodbye to our audience, I just want to thank you for taking the time to join us. And we have one last poll question for you that should appear on your screen soon. How would you rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation following this lecture? So everyone, please take a moment and respond to that before you move on with your day. So feel free to share today's talk with your friends. It'll be posted on our York Alumni YouTube channel. You can also join our LinkedIn group and follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at YorkU Alumni. And as always, feedback about today's session or any of our programming, suggestions for what we can do better or what we can do next are always welcome. And you can reach us at alumni@yorku.ca. So Scholars Hub is back again tomorrow. We're doubling up this week. So you can join us tomorrow, Wednesday, September 30th at noon Eastern Time for addressing Mi'kmaq history in the novel Nin Delay Owe Incan Mi'kmaq, Sojourns in England, with Benita Lawrence, who's a professor in the Department of Humanities, LMPS, chair of the Department of Equity Studies, and coordinator of the Indigenous Studies program. And then next week on Wednesday, October 7th at noon, you can join us for Indigenous Nationhood in the Age of COVID-19, reflection on the evolution of sovereignty in settler colonial states. And that will feature Sean Hillier, assistant professor in the School of Health Policy and Management. You can learn about all of our events on our website, yorku.ca/alumni and friends, and click on events. As always, thank you for joining us, and be well.